Good morning and welcome to members and the public to the 7th meeting in 2013 of the Health and Sport Committee. And as usual at this point, can I remind those present to switch off all mobile phones and Blackberries and other wireless devices as they often can interfere with our sound system. Our first item on the agenda today is to consider whether to take item 9 in private. Item 9 is the committee's approach to consideration of waiting times. And can I have the committee's agreement that we will take item 9 in private? Yeah. Thank you for that. We now move to agenda item number 2, which is consideration of subordinate legislation. There are 3 affirmative instruments before the committee this morning, and we will take evidence from the Minister of Public Health on each instrument and then have the debate on that instrument before moving to the next one. The first instrument under consideration today is the Draft Tobacco and Primary Medical Services Scotland Act 2010, Incidental Provision and Commencement Number 4 Order 2013. Can I now move to welcome Michael Matheson, Minister for Public Health, Rosemary Lindsay, Principal Legal Officer for Food, Health and Community Care in the Scottish Government, Siobhan Mackay, Tobacco Control Advisor of the Scottish Government. Welcome to you all. I'm going to now invite the Minister to make his opening statement. Thank you.
Thank you, Convener. The purpose of this draft affirmative order is to commence Section 9 of the Tobacco and Primary Medical Services Scotland Act 2010. This section relates to the ban on sale of tobacco products from vending machines, which, as you know, were subject to legal challenge from Imperial Tobacco and Sinclair Collis. The legislation was approved by Parliament in 2010, and I'm pleased that both challenges were dismissed by the courts. We are now in a position to implement the legislation, which will come into force on the 29th of April this year. And I'm happy to respond to any questions that the committee members may have, and I move the motion.
Thank you, Minister. Do any members present have any questions? Richard Simpson?
Yes. What discussions have you had with the vending machine producers, who were, of course, opposed to this measure originally? What discussions have you had with them about the regulations which you're now introducing, and what was their response?
There were, at the time of the legislation, there was obviously engagement with the companies who used vending machines. But since then, what we have provided them with is notification of when this order will come into force, and that's the 29th of April. They were notified of this at the end of January this year.
Yep.
Are there any other questions for the Minister? If not, then they will move. Thank the Minister and his officials for participating in that question session. And we now then move to agenda item number 3, which is the debate on the instrument. And can I remind members that Standing Order Rule 12.2.2 allows no more than 90 minutes for the debate. We're confident we'll not use that time up. And the time for asking questions is now over, because we are now entering that debate. And of course, the Scottish Government officials know now that they may not speak in the debate. Can I invite the Minister to move the motion set out below?
Moved.
Thank you. Can I offer the Minister the opportunity of any opening remarks?
Other than to reinforce that I think this is an important part of our overall tobacco control strategy to reduce smoking in Scotland, which is an important public health measure.
Thank you. Do any of the members wish to say anything in the debate? Richard Simpson?
Just to congratulate the government on seeing off the attempt to prevent this important tobacco control measure coming in. I'm glad that that's happened. I hope that we have been awarded costs That's not a question because I'm not allowed to ask a question at this point, but I'd be interested to know whether we've managed to regain costs of these challenges that have been made to us. I think it's interesting that the tobacco industry worldwide challenges every tobacco control measure that comes in. Australia and New Zealand are facing the same problem in relation to plain packaging. So I very much welcome this measure and welcome the legislation, the subordinate legislation now coming in to effect this important change.
Any other members? Minister?
Other than to say that I agree with Richard Simpson in the issue of costs. This is a matter which we are pursuing, and I've also given an indication that that money will go back into the tobacco control strategy and possibly as part of an education programme which could be used should the courts decide to award us costs.
Thank you, Minister. I now put the question on the motion, which is on S4M 05715, that the Health and Sport Committee recommends the Tobacco and Primary Medical Services Scotland Act 2010, Incidental Provision and Commencement Number 4, Order 2013, draft be approved. Are we all agreed? Agreed. We agree. Thank you. You can suspend briefly to allow a change of officials before we move to agenda item number 4. And Mike Liddell's not. We now move to agenda item number 4, which is consideration of another affirmative SSI, the Draft Social Care and Social Work Improvement Scotland Requirements for Care Services Amendment Regulations 2013. The Minister, of course, has remained in this place, but he is now joined by Mike Liddell, Team Leader, Reshaping Care, Kirsty McGrath, Branch Head, Protection of Rights Unit, Scottish Government, and Victoria MacDonald, Senior Principal Legal Officer, Food, Health and Community Care Division of the Scottish Government. Welcome to you all, and I invite the Minister to make some opening remarks.
Convener, thank you for a chance to say a few words about these regulations, the Social Care and Social Work Improvement Scotland Requirements for Care Services Amendment Regulations 2013. The committee will recall that over the last few years there has been an increase in the number of care service providers experiencing financial difficulties. Most notably of these has been the collapse of the Southern Cross Group. At the time of those difficulties, the Scottish Government worked closely with colleagues in COSLA and the Care Inspectorate to ensure that the needs of care service users were prioritised. In particular, we sought to minimise the disruption to care home residents when care homes had to shut down. Many lessons were learnt from the work done around the collapse of Southern Cross, and it's important that we build on this. To this end, we have continued to work with colleagues in the UK Government, COSLA and the Care Inspectorate and other stakeholders to put together a package of improvements in the delivery of care services, incorporating increased scrutiny, contingency planning and the development of new models of service delivery. All of this work will take time, but these regulations mark a first significant step in improving matters. The regulations do two things. They remove the offence of continuing to provide a care service while the provider is in administration, and they require care service providers to immediately notify the Care Inspectorate of any insolvency event. Turning to the first of these points, when a care home provider enters administration, generally the administrator will appoint a new provider to take over the provision of the service. However, in certain cases over the past couple of years, it was clear that the best solution for residents of some homes was to allow the existing provider to continue to provide the service while in administration. This gave important reassurance and continuity of care to service users, but was unfortunately in breach of the offence of providing a care home service while in administration. Following discussions with the Care Inspectorate, it was clear that this offence no longer served any purpose and could in fact be detrimental to care service users if it prevented the best option for service users being taken. We therefore seek to remove this offence. However, it would be inappropriate to remove the offence without making some provision for ensuring that the Care Inspectorate are fully aware of the financial position of a care service provider. Hence, the new requirement for care service providers to immediately notify the Care Inspectorate when an insolvency event has or is about to occur. We have found that the earlier the Care Inspectorate is made aware of the financial situation of a care service provider, the sooner they can assess the situation and can respond appropriately. The response of the Care Inspectorate varies on a case-by-case basis, but can include increasing the risk assessment of the care service, increasing the level of financial monitoring, alerting and liaising with other agencies, and if necessary, taking enforcement action to ensure adequate standards of care are maintained. The new requirements will ensure the Care Inspectorate are notified at the earliest opportunity of any financial difficulties a care service provider may be facing, and they can take the appropriate steps to support the provider and, most importantly, the service users during any transition phase. And I'm happy to respond to any questions committee members may have.
Thank the Minister for that opening statement. Are there any questions from committee members? No. Can someone give me an idea what an insolvency event is, or would look like, or?
It could be a business that's struggling to pay some of its bills, its debts, and as a result is getting into a position where it may be insolvent. So at that point, they should be notifying the Care Inspectorate that they're having financial difficulties.
So yeah, I mean, I think we dealt with some of this work and are very supportive of this type of action as a first step. But would if overdraft facilities were denied of them or something with a bank, then they would be at that point in a discussion with the Care Inspectorate. Is that?
They would be expected to notify the Care Inspectorate that they were starting to reach financial difficulties as a result of these types of things.
So how would we ensure that that happened?
Well, this is a requirement now for them to actually do it, and will be part of the requirement to the Care Inspectorate. There is a responsibility in the actual care provider to make sure that they comply with these regulations, and it's important they notify the Care Inspector of that as early as possible. It's difficult for the Care Inspectorate to be aware of that unless they're being notified, but this for the first time places a requirement on them as part of the regulations to actually make sure they do that.
What if they don't meet that requirement? What happens?
Well, there's always the risk that if they don't meet the requirements within a regulation, that it would be later notified to the Care Inspector, at which point they would have to take different action. I would suggest that it's in the interest of a service provider to notify them as early as possible. But it's down to them to make sure the Care Inspector are notified at the earliest possible stage. Yeah,
it's just, you know, sometimes when you get the picture of insolvency, managerial breakdown, we know that can be have very serious consequences on the residents, that financial crisis. And, you know, it's just, what I know the regulations there, but if they're not meeting other regulations in the care of the people in their care and whatever, what's the imperative that they would encouraged to let people know for their own sake, in terms of how we'd approach a breakdown.
There's obviously a range of different ways that the Care Inspectorate can get intelligence about these types of issues. For example, care managers who are within a local authority or working with a particular care home provider that notice there's been changes in the care standards where it's because they're getting into financial difficulty. They may not be aware of that, but issues that they could then report to the Care Inspectorate. So, but it's a requirement that's been placed upon them. They're in a situation where ultimately the Care Inspectorate could cancel their registration if they're not complying with the requirements that are placed upon them under regulations. But it is down to the actual care service provider to notify the Care Inspectorate of these things.
Bob.
Thanks very much, Convener. I think, Minister, first of all, say that I think this provides reassurance of continuity of service for cared for people in a residential setting should any company go into administration or face financial difficulties, where in the past this committee saw that a lot of service users immediately thought they would have to find another provider and there was huge uncertainty. This provides that reassurance. I think some of the questions is perhaps a wider issue. So I would have a couple of questions perhaps on the wider issue, Minister. If a company didn't inform the Care Inspectorate as it was statutorily obliged to do, would that constitute a criminal offence that the owners of the company or the board of the company could be prosecuted under? So that would be something I'd be interested to know. But I think also in terms of what the terminology of an insolvency event, I think is pretty well laid out in the statute instrument before us, and that is quite clear. So I'm not going to ask a question on that. I suppose my question would rather be taking it back slightly. First Minister, of course, would be keen to know when there is an imminent threat of an insolvency event. In other words, if a company knows it is on the brink, there's nothing to compel it to inform the Care Inspectorate that it is potentially facing insolvency. All the requirements on it, my understanding would be, is once it enters into the insolvency process, is there any way this Parliament or this government could compel, and I think we looked at this in some detail before and we found significant difficulties in being able to do this, but is there any way we can compel care home owners to inform the Care Inspectorate of its financial health and well-being itself in terms of pre-insolvency event? And if so, is that something that you would look to legislate on in the future, or if not, is it powers you would seek to have?
Okay. In relation to your first point around notification on this type of issue, this would be a matter around the breach of the regulations to do with their registration as a care service provider. And therefore, if the company have failed to comply with those regulations, then it would then be for the Care Inspectorate to then start the process of looking at their registration and whether there is further measures that they have to take in terms of enforcement action against them as a result of that. I'm sure members will appreciate it's difficult for the Care Inspectorate to be in a position where it can actually, quite literally on a day-to-day basis, have oversight of a care service provider's financial situation. But this is a new step to require them to provide that they have to give notification should they find themselves at an insolvency event that may occur. The wider aspect around the financial stability of care service providers, that's been part of the discussion that's been taken forward with COSLA and with other stakeholders in looking at, where as part of the National Care Homes contract, whether there is more work can be done in terms of around the diligence process of those care agencies and care service providers that they're working with to provide services, to look at some of the financial factors around their businesses. And we're continuing that work with COSLA to look at what could be put in place to try and give further consideration to these types of issues when local authorities are looking to place contracts with care service providers. So my answer is that that's an area of work we're still taking forward. How that will then materialise, whether it will be regulations or whether it will be part of the national contract, has yet to be decided. But if there are measures which we can take which can help to make the system more robust, then there's a willingness on the part of the government to do so. What we have to do is find what's the best mechanism for achieving that.
Can I come in?
Yes,
briefly? Can I-
certainly. Yep.
Completely reassured in terms of the second part of what you say about the discussions with COSLA and this committee saw the difficulties in working out how you measure and monitor the financial robustness of any business involved in the care sector. In terms of the first question I asked about it's a breach of registration requirements with the Care Inspectorate if you don't inform of an insolvency event. I don't know, it might not be within the powers of this Parliament, I'm not sure, Minister, but I would have thought there should be a duty that goes beyond just a care registration process for a company to inform the Care Inspectorate or whoever within this Parliament and this government if they were experiencing an insolvency event and failed to do that. So I would like to think that could go beyond the scope of a mere registration requirement that could then be withdrawn as a registration, and the other consequences could befall individuals that are in breach of that. Is that consideration that the Scottish Government has given?
The whole issue about the issue of different models of care provision is something which we're still looking at. What I would imagine will prove to be a difficult thing to establish is how do you define when a business decides that it's actually got financial difficulties? An insolvency event is something that we can clearly make reference to and we can identify, but you will have different businesses who will view their financial situation in a different way. So part of the challenge in actually trying to make sure that care service providers provide notification to the Care Inspectorate at the earliest opportunity will be how do you define that in regulation? That's when you have to notify them. Part of this, of course, is around the work that part of it can also be addressed around the work that the Care Inspectorate carries out with its with individual care providers as part of their routine ongoing work. In discussing with them their financial situation and whether there's a need for further scrutiny in that area, if there's an indication that there are problems and where they have to then place enforcement requirements upon them. So I think part of the challenge might be how you would actually define when a care service provider has got financial difficulties, and at that point they then have to notify the Care Inspectorate of that.
Okay, thank you.
Bill Patterson and Richard
Much,
Simpson.
Convener. It's in the same line, Minister, and maybe there's a couple of questions rolled into what I'm about to say. Private companies at the present time have a duty of care in all sorts of ways, with health and safety and lots of other things, but the one thing they don't have is a duty of care on solvency. These are, in business, private companies hold that really close to their chest. They don't want it out there because they may be able, it's maybe a short-term situation, cash flow, and then they go over it. So they try not to put that out into the wider public. So I'm wondering if this measure incorporates into a duty of care health care home providers. It seems like that to me. And if I can roll that into another part of what happens normally, the way that we get to hear about insolvency or cash flow is because the suppliers or people who are employed by that individual company will blow the whistle and say, we're not getting paid, quite frequently in football teams, I've got to say. But in wider business, people, suppliers, not getting paid. Would the inspectorate then, if they had a complaint, because I'm quite sure that the inspectorate would not have the powers to go into a private company and audit their books. I don't think it happens in any other place. So you need to be, the duty of care then kicks in, you need to notify. So if a complaint came in from an outside body, a supplier or an employee, that they weren't meeting their financial obligations, would the inspectorate then take action and go in and then ask positively for information in that regard?
Okay. I think Gil Patterson raises an important point, that is that very often commercial businesses will keep this type of information very close to their chest if they are having financial difficulties because of the implications it can have for their business, particularly with competitors. If the Care Inspectorate were notified by a company who supplied a care service provider with a particular service and their bills were not being paid, then the Care Inspectorate could ask for information, financial information from that care service provider if there was a suspicion that they were having financial difficulty. And they could increase their risk assessment of that particular service provider as a result. That's largely an intelligence-based approach that they would take in evidence that they receive both from the company that's not been paid and also the service provider when they provide them with further financial information. So it could be used as one piece of information that could give an indication that there are problems, and for the Care Inspectorate to then consider what action might be appropriate and proportionate as well, and whether they have to increase their risk assessment of that particular company and to request information from them to see whether there are concerns.
If that was the case, and I know how it works, where your competitors, and there are competitors in this field also, you've always got competitors, would the inspectorate go in quietly to assess that, to see if it was a short-term a problem, that something that may have happened within that business? Would they go in quietly, or would they go in with all guns blazing? Would the public get to know about it smartish, or would it be sensitively handled?
I think essentially they would. I'd like to think they would do it on a quiet basis until they actually build up a body of evidence around where there are issues. Clearly, once they've undertaken an assessment, and if they feel that other parties need to be involved in considering a response to the financial difficulties the company has, for example, a local authority or other service users, then they would obviously look at engaging with them and to then look at what action can be taken. So, the first step in this whole process would be is to gather as much evidence as possible and then to assess what response is necessary and who else may require to be involved in any response. And as I mentioned, that could be the local authority or other service users. And whether that then is extended out to notifying residents and families of residents is all the type of thing that would have to be dealt with on an individual basis in individual circumstances. And for the Care Inspectorate to respond to these issues as they see appropriate at that particular time.
Thanks for that, Minister. Thanks.
Richard Simpson.
I should declare an interest in that I've had a relative in a care home, which was one of a group of 3, which was in administration. So I very much welcome this change, because I think it is inappropriate for it to be an offence to continue the business under the administrator, which is what happened in the case of my relative in a quite satisfactory way. However, I'm slightly concerned that we're only placing a duty of care or a duty on the provider. Why did you decide not to make it an offence not to notify? Because it seems to me the notification is the important thing here, and having that at the level of an offence might have been more appropriate. So could you perhaps outline the thinking, or perhaps one of the officials, because it is a little complex.
The approach that's been taken with this in consultation with the Care Inspectorate is to tie it down to their registration requirements and their registration as a care service provider, and to make the change so that it is an issue around that they have to give notification as part of their registration as a care service provider. Their view that was the most pragmatic way in which to deal with it. And in my view, it appears to be in a proportionate way to do it. The focus here has got to be on trying to make sure that we maintain the quality of care for the service users. And by tying it into the registration, we've seen as a way of actually helping to reinforce that.
I mean, I think that's something the committee might want to hear from you in future as to how well that's working, because, as I say, I do have some slight residual concerns. I think Bob Doris's questioning was somewhat along the same line as to, how can you ensure these people notify? If you're going out of business anyway, what's in it for you not to notify? You're going to lose your career registration anyway. Administrator's going to take over your job, your business. Why should you bother notifying the Care Commission in the first place? And there's no comeback on you. So I think, I've got some slight concerns about that.
And part of the challenge will be is further down the chain is that at which point would you require information to be provided to the Care Inspectorate if they are having financial difficulty. Because for different businesses, that will be a different threshold, and it will be in different circumstances. So it's probably quite a difficult area to actually define, but I think the earlier notification, the better. And I think one of the ways in which we can try and help to improve in this area is around the way in which local authorities do the national contract, how they undertake some of the diligence process that they complete at the time when they're looking to use a particular service. And I think there's room for further progress to be made in that area, and it's clear from the feedback we've had from COSLA that's an area that they want to see further progress on as well, which I think could help to address some of the concerns, which I think are legitimate concerns that members are raising.
Thank you. And
I think it is reassuring to hear the Minister saying that, that there are some concerns, because in the evidence that we took, and I think we all need to bear in mind that if a care home is not up to standard, then the nuclear option is to close that care home down, with the impact on the continuity of care for those residents. And I'm struggling to understand how this measure will not lead to the same sort of conclusion if they hit a temporary financial crisis, they decide not to inform, comes about, either Richard, as Richard described, they become insolvent and they lose their accreditation, or it's later found out that they had an insolvency event and didn't report it, and they lose their accreditation because of that, then you're in effect bringing about the closure of that home at the end of the day. I don't see how this is going to change behaviour. And I mean, we're all supportive in changing behaviour, flagging up early financial problems to have, get the discussion going with the people who are using that home, the residents. But I don't know, I'm not convinced that this is doing it.
Well, I'm not suggesting that these regulations are the panacea to deal with all of the issues around some of the financial challenges that care service providers are facing. These are just two of the initial steps that we're taking to try and address issues that have been highlighted from some of the learning we have from the Southern Cross experience. Some of the work that we are still undertaken with the UK government and looking at other models of service provision, also with COSLA and with the sector as areas of work that we're still taking forward. So this is not the end of the process. If anything, this is the beginning of that process, and there's a couple of examples of the immediate steps that we can take off the back of it. As it stands at the present moment, there is no requirement on a care service provider to notify the Care Inspectorate if they have had an insolvency event. I had an issue a number of years ago when a care service provider in my own constituency quite literally brought down the shutters on a Friday afternoon. And for many of those that they provided care for that weekend, the local authority had to step in and try to meet that because there was no requirement in them to notify anybody of that. This requirement now places an obligation on them as part of their registration to make sure that the Care Inspectorate are notified. But clearly it's important that as soon as that they are notified of this, is for them to then assess what action might be appropriate. And alongside that, if there is an issue about trying to manage the care setting at that particular point using the existing staff, then it also provides an opportunity for that to happen without anyone committing an offence and to allow continuity of care for the service users themselves. So this is very much a first step. It's not the final answer to the wider issue around some of the financial challenges there are within the care sector.
the last question is really following on from Gil Patterson's question, and that is, if someone makes a complaint about the care within a home, that complaint will be registered with the Care Commission. As I understand it, it'll go up on the website, even if it's then said to be investigated and found to be not correct, or partially upheld, or not upheld. But and I don't think that's inappropriate, because I think it should be open and transparent. Although I know that sometimes care home people are, somewhat concerned about that, because you can get people making complaints that are not actually appropriate. But I think there's one thing to do that for the care quality. It's another thing to do it for financial quality. So if a creditor complains because they haven't had a bill paid, say that's in dispute, that going up might trigger other creditors to say, hang on a minute, we'll need to rush in. It might, force an insolvency which might not otherwise have happened. It might create a degree of uncertainty, which I think Gil Patterson was hinting at, in which that person's business is exposed in a way that we wouldn't really want to happen. So are creditor complaints going to be treated differently from other complaints or not?
I think, going back to the point that Gil Patterson was making, is that, which we were trying to explain to the committee, is that I would expect the Care Inspectorate to use that as a piece of intelligence to then check with that care service provider whether there are financial issues and to request financial information. And to deal with that in a sensitive way, because, yes, sure, it's a good point, is that you potentially could cause other unintended consequences if you go in with, as Gil Patterson was alluding to, with all guns blazing and making everybody aware of this particular issue. If there's a particular creditor who's not been paid, it's for the Care Inspectorate to identify what the reasons for that are. Is it a disputed bill, or is it an issue that they just don't have the money to pay it? And if so, we need financial information to consider what further assessment we have to take of the risks involved with this particular business. So it's difficult to lay down a single black and white policy for all of these things, because they will materialise in different ways, and you have to deal with it on an individual case-by-case basis. But it's got to be intelligence-based, and it's got to be about trying to make sure where there is an issue, if there's a action that the Care Inspectorate should take as a result of the information that they are provided with. So I hope that provides reassurance that it's not about creditors using it as a way of trying to embarrass the company in order to get their bill paid if it's been disputed, but it's used by the Care Inspectorate to find out whether there is actually a genuine financial problem with the business, rather than just a dispute between a creditor and the purchaser.
Thank you.
Thank the Minister for that, and I'm sure he is aware that the level of questioning was on the basis that we, as a committee, have done a bit of work on that, and indeed it's useful for the record after that session to recognise that we, as a committee, recognise that this was an issue, and that early information about the financial status, and indeed at the time of accreditation of some of those ones, is a very important piece of information for the continuity of care. And I think we are at one with them, and it is interesting. And the final question is, I suppose, as he suggests to the Minister, with all these bits and pieces and the committee's work, there may be, or we may be, create an opportunity that you can come back and discuss this in a wider sense, rather than the confines of this SSI, which might put you in a better position to discuss all of what's happening and the progress that the government intends to make, and hopefully you would agree to that at some future date.
Of course, I'd be more than happy to look at doing that myself for the Cabinet Secretary. I'm sure we'd be more than willing to do that.
Yes, okay, thanks for that. I don't see any other questions. So we now move to agenda item number 5, which is the debate on the affirmative instrument, on which we are just taking evidence from the Minister. We invite the Minister to move the motion set out below.
Moved.
Thank you. Any opening remarks from the Minister?
No.
Thank you. We are now at that point of debate, and I invite any members who wish to take part in the debate. Bob Doris.
Minister, I just wanted to make a few observations during the debate, and it links into what the convener said. I actually think that these are incredibly positive regulation in the SSI that's been put before us. It's it seems quite odd that if a company in the high street goes into administration, say selling jeans, the administrator could still open the doors and sell those jeans, but technically, under the rules before us, a care home would have to close up its shutters and cease to trade and support the most vulnerable people in society. So it's vitally important we do this, and I'll certainly be supporting it. I think that the wider conversation has been around the inquiry into regulation of care for older people that this committee did not that long ago, and I have to say that's been one of the most rewarding inquiries that I've been involved in the Parliament, because the government responded to concerns that were raised, I think, before we even completed our inquiry, which shows how the committees of this Parliament can actually work with the government to improve the system of regulation for older people. And I think it's important to put that on the record. I think it's also important to put on the record during this kind of small debate that we recognised during our inquiry the significant difficulties in how you determine a company that could be at financial risk and when it would be appropriate for the care inspector or others to analyse that. So I'm delighted that work is still ongoing with COSLA to see if we can flesh out a way to make that a reality. I'd also maybe put on the record that if there is a case where a care provider can just pull the shutters down and lock the door and not inform the care inspectorate, that we maybe have to look at some point in the future to determine what fate should befall the owner of that company, out with the inability to have registration as a care home provider in the future. And that's maybe something we need to return to as a committee. I think it's maybe important though to say those instances are few and far between, and virtually all the care providers, irrespective of who owns the care homes, are putting their residents first and working closely with the local authorities and other partners to provide the best service possible. So in raising these concerns, I wouldn't want to overstate the case. It's making sure that the system is as comprehensive as it can be, and I'll certainly be supporting the SSI that's before us.
Gil Patterson.
Thank you very much for that, Convener. Maybe I should say that I come from not from the health background. I try to put myself in the position of a business, because that's what broadly these institutions are. And you know, there are bad reasons or good reasons for people who go bust, and it's very often not their own fault. Not Southern Cross in this regard. So you can imagine that if you have a big creditor who doesn't pay you, and through no fault of your own, your cash flow goes AWOL, and it could threaten your business. And that's why I said would we go in quietly, because it may well be that although banks, I found banks actually very helpful through this bad time with my business. So I hear everybody doom and gloom about banks, but that's not my experience. It's been good for my company. But so if you have a short-term problem, then you can approach a bank, or you can approach your other creditors to say, somebody's taken me to the cleaners here, I've lost a pot of money, can you give me a bit more time? That's what typically happens in every other business, and I would see the same thing happening in this sector also. So I don't think we should, you know, the one bit that I don't agree here is that I don't think in law, in company law, that anyone can go into a company and examine their books. I don't think you'll make that stand up if we try to do it. And I think it could be challenged. In my views, we would lose the challenge. Company has the right to run their business, and they need to keep a lot of things from their competitors. It would be strange that we took one sector out of every other sector and said, this is how you're going to be treated. So I don't think it could happen in that regard. But I very much support what's proposed here, because the one element of it is that now we're in a situation where the continuity of a business and the end result would be people in care are going to be looked after at a time when it's very traumatic, so that we can find another buyer for it. I may state, I don't like private buyers and sellers in this market. I would love it to be all in the public sector. That's my position on it. But nevertheless, this is the world that we're in at the present time. And if it is a business, you need to have some continuity for the business, and you need continuity for the individuals that have been cared for at a particular time. So I very much welcome what you've brought here. And I do like the idea of the pressure that's put on a business on duty of care. I don't think a lot of people know how important it is and how most responsible businesses react to it. And I see this as quite a powerful weapon to put in that kind of framework, a duty of care on your finances. It doesn't happen anywhere else. And if we can make it stack up, I think it's a very potent weapon that we have now got.
Any other members wish to take part in the debate? No. Minister, your response, closing remarks.
I think they've been very helpful comments, and I think we, both the contributions illustrate the complexities around some of this issue, and it's an area which I think we have to continue to look at how we can improve on the way in which we operate with private care service providers, around the whole issue of financial difficulties that may arise from problems that they have as a business. I think it would be fair to say that when the Care Regulations Act in 2001 was introduced, the reason that this particular offence was created around a company in administration continue to provide care was because it was considered at that time as that they wouldn't meet the fit and proper person test if their company was in registration. And there's been no suggestion since that's been introduced until recent times where some practical experience has actually suggested that it could actually be an inhibitor to maintaining individuals' care and not always necessarily getting something in the best interests of the service users. So I think these new regulations allow us to make sure that we learn from that experience and that we put in place measures that make the system robust but also have a focus on helping to maintain the quality of care that service users receive.
Okay, thanks for that, Minister. I now put the question on the motion, which is on S4M 05716, that the Health and Sport Committee recommends that the Social Care and Social Work Improvement Scotland requirements for care services amendment regulations 2013 be approved. Are we all agreed? Yes. Thank you. That is agreed. Agenda item number 6 is to take evidence on our third and final affirmative SSI this morning, Community Care, Personal Care and Nursing Care Scotland Amendment Regulations 2013. Can I invite the Minister to make an opening statement?
Thank you, Convener. I will be brief. The draft affirmative order before committee today reflects the Scottish Government's commitment to increase free personal and nursing care payments in line with inflation. The order, if approved, will continue to benefit vulnerable older people. Last year, we increased the personal and nursing care payment for residents in care homes in line with inflation. The regulations will further increase, in line with inflation, the weekly payment for personal care by £3 to £166 per week, and will increase the additional nursing care payment by £1 to £75 per week. In line with our partnership agreement with local government, councils will meet the costs of the inflationary increase, totalling around £1.8 million in 2013-14. An additional amount of £1.5 million annually was added to the funding for local authorities in October 2012 to cover these additional costs in the current spending review period up to 2014-15. The free personal care and nursing care policy continues to command strong support, and I hope the draft order will receive the committee's support today.
Thank you very much for that, Minister. Is there any questions from members? No questions. Therefore, we move now to agenda item 7, which is the debate on the affirmative instrument, on which we have just taken evidence from the Minister. I invite the Minister to move the motion set out below.
Moved.
Thank you. Minister, wish to make any further remarks?
No further comment.
Thank you. Is there any member wishes to take part in the debate? No, thanks. It remains for me then to put, the Minister doesn't want to make any additional, no. Put the question of the motion as on S4M 05713, that the Health and Sport Committee recommends that the Community Care, Personal Care and Nursing Care Scotland Amendment Regulations 2013 be approved. Are we all agreed? Thank you very much. We're just going to suspend briefly, shuffle the pack again here. We now move to agenda item number 8, which is the final evidence session on our inquiry into teenage pregnancy. And can we welcome back the Minister for Public Health, who has remained in his seat throughout the time. And he is joined by Felicity Sung, the National Coordinator Sexual Health HIV Scottish Government. Welcome. I invite the Minister to make an opening statement.
Thank you, Convener. The rates of teenage pregnancy have been reducing consistently over the last 4 years, with rates of under 18s now at their lowest level since 1994. This is a significant achievement and should not be underestimated. It reflects the hard work of our stakeholders in addressing teenage pregnancy through the use of evidence-informed and effective interventions. However, we cannot be complacent. I wish to see Scotland continue this trend whilst also achieving larger reductions in our rates of teenage pregnancy, acknowledging the impact that early parenthood can have on both parent and child. The committee has already heard about the complex issues that lie behind teenage pregnancy. We know that preventing teenage conceptions cannot be achieved by health interventions alone, and we need to better acknowledge the role of deprivation, inequality and lack of aspiration and opportunity can have. As such, I wish to see all stakeholders taking account of the most up-to-date evidence on what works so that we can support our young people to delay parenthood until they are in a position to provide a stable home for parent and baby. The impact of local authorities cannot be underestimated, particularly in their role in preventing teenage pregnancy and supporting young people to stay connected with education so that they have aspiration and opportunity for the future. For those young people who do become parents at a young age, high-quality support services such as those provided by family nurse partnerships are vital. Young mothers have been telling me about their experience of motherhood, the difficulties, but also the positives, and how, in some cases, their role as a parent has impacted on their lives for the better. It's important that we listen to young people and understand how we can best support them to delay parenthood, but also appreciate that if they choose parenthood, how they can become the best parents they wish to be. And I'd be happy to respond to any issues raised by the committee.
Thank the Minister for those opening remarks. We move now to Richard Simpson.
Yes. Our system in Scotland is through the single outcome agreements with the local authorities, and I think, as you said, Minister, the role of the local authorities as well as the health boards in delivering a continuing downward pressure on teenage pregnancies which are not desired by those who become pregnant is really important. Can I ask you what sort of discussions have taken place in terms of your review of the health boards as to what discussions they've had with the local authorities on the single outcome agreements? Is it now a specific item? Because Scotland is still above the average and still has a significantly higher rate of teenage pregnancy. than, for example, Holland and other countries. We've still got a long ways to go, as you've said. We can't afford to be complacent. So, you know, is there the questioning of what's actually happening at a local level? And I ask this question in part because of my experience in going to Oldham, where in England, having issued very clear guidance nationally and indeed toolkits on which to operate, Oldham was not actually declining in terms of its teenage pregnancy in the way that was wanted. It was still well above the average. And the minister actually, the ministerial team actually called in the local authority to discuss what was happening and to examine what further support could be offered where they were not actually achieving things. So the result of that was a renewed focus by all the chief executives and the education director and the rest. And it then led to a very substantial reduction because of a highly coordinated response. So I'm just would like you to tell us what the government has been doing in this respect to try and drive these rates down, particularly in areas where the rate has remained high or above the average.
I think a key part to Richard Simpson's question is that to deal with this issue, you have to take a number of different approaches. There is no magic bullet in dealing with the whole issue of teenage pregnancies, and that you require a multi-agency response to dealing with these issues, from local authority through to the health service and, where necessary, third sector organisations working in partnership. And one of the things that we've set out in the part of the outcomes through the Sexual Health and Bloodborne Viruses strategy is for local authorities to set within the single outcome agreement the issue of looking at reducing teenage pregnancies within their area, and some local authorities have taken that forward. What I think has limited some of the progress that we could have made in this area has been, I think at times, an over-focus on treating this as a health issue, that this is a matter which can be dealt with through our health service. And I've got no doubt in some of the visits that you've undertaken as a committee, you've noted that actually local authorities have an important part to play in helping to keep young people engaged in education, etc., which can all, for example, the base that you visited in Glasgow is a good example of that, where they can obviously help to keep young mothers engaged with education and to improve their own aspiration and opportunities in the future. And one of the challenges I think that we face in going forward in this area that I'm interested in is how we can make sure that our health boards and our local authorities work in a much more cooperative and engaged way in dealing with the different issues that they are responsible for addressing. There are some areas where we've had good partnership working between health and local authority, but there are other areas where it has not been as successful. And I think part of the challenge is about how we can go about achieving that. And a key part of that is recognising that this is not an issue that sits in health alone, that it needs a multi-agency response from local authority through to the health service. And some of the work that I'm looking to take forward is to look at how we can develop that further, particularly the partnership between health and local authority, and to do it in a way which is much more focused in areas where there are particularly high levels of teenage pregnancies.
Yes. One of the problems, it seems to me, is that we're not particularly good about spreading good practice. I mean, I think the committee has seen quite a lot of good practice out there. And, the fact that the Family Nurse Partnership, which is now being rolled out, is going to help, at least for those families who are eligible to get onto that programme. But I just wonder if we've got Health Improvement Scotland in relation to the health service, but how do we actually marry it up with ensuring that there's effective transmission of good practice, which is being undertaken either by the local authority or by the local authority jointly with health? How can we ensure that good practice is actually rolled out?
It's a constant challenge trying to get good practice that I see as a minister in visiting one health board area to try and get other health boards to learn from that and to utilise that rather than reinventing the wheel and doing something in their own patch in a different way, when you can build on the experience of other boards. And there have been a number of attempts over a variety of years to try and hold good practice events where they can come and share experience and they can learn from that and take it back and use it within their own local authority or health board area. One of the things that, and clearly the committee will come forward with its own recommendations following its inquiry, but one of the things that I would be interested in hearing the committee's views on is whether the whole issue of teenage pregnancies is something which should be out with the sexual health and bloodborne viruses strategy. Should it be a standalone strategy which is a joint health local authority strategy to try and help to give greater focus in drawing these areas together, and also to look at how they can use the resources and share that more effectively? That may be one way in which we could go about trying to draw some of this good practice between health and local authorities closer together and to share that experience more effectively. And it may be that one of the lessons from Oldham, of which I've got very limited knowledge, is that by having a strategy that brings the two of them together and is shared with shared outcomes, would be a way of achieving much greater direction taking place at a localised level. And I'd be interested in the committee's views on whether that's something they feel would merit consideration given your own experience and evidence you've heard.
Allow others to comment on that, but if I could just have one final point, that is, underlying it all is adequate data, and certainly the thing that impressed me in Oldham was the fact that the data was being published by ward and by school, and that schools who were comparable in terms of deprivation, you know, were matched up. So there was a friendly element of competition, as it were. There was a you know, because some schools thought they were doing very well, but when they saw the data published, they were pretty horrified, frankly, and it then became a priority. So are you satisfied that we've got data down to the level which will actually allow the local implementation groups to have the effects that we want them to have?
Obviously, the data at a national level is published by ISD, and there is always a challenge in publishing certain data at a national level, is how far you can go down to a localised level without causing some difficulties in certain communities, which could where there's a small amount of information that you may hold on a particular ward and how it could then be identified, etc., which is always going to be a challenge. However, some of the work that's been taken forward by NHS Fife, where they have been able to get the data right down to individual areas using postcodes, where they've been able to identify 4 schools in a particular area. They've been able to use that as a way of targeting specific resources into given areas. So it is possible to get down to that particular level, given the data that is available. The challenge, I think, is to get our boards and local authorities to use that in a consistent way, and for those to learn from the experience that we have in Fife. Now, some of that data that's been collected in Fife is only a year or so old, and some of the actions they've taken off the back of that, with some of the specific action points in different schools, is only a year or so old. So we're still learning from that experience, and I think we're due to meet with them next month, if I recall correctly, as well, to explore some of that. But it is possible. And what we need to do is to see whether we can get other boards and local authorities to work at that level and to then target their response to those particular schools in a much more tailored way, which will allow them to respond to those local issues.
Thank you.
You know, just on the data, has anybody else want in this point? Just on the data, you know, are we simply just measuring teenage pregnancies? Are there other elements that we should be measuring, like teenage terminations or whatever, that gives us, should be aimed to reduce those as well?
My understanding is that there are the data tends to be in some occasions people have said the data is quite old. It can be 18 months old from the point. The data collection point is at the point of where a termination takes place or the baby is delivered. And obviously there's a period of time that can lapse with that, and then when the data is then submitted to ISD, and then the data is then checked by ISD, and then it's published. So there can be a time lag in that area. But my understanding is that in terms of terminations, that there is data collected in that area around that at the present moment.
You know, I think you know, the minister's opening statement in regards to the figures that you know, I think we all recognise in this committee that progress has been made. I think what the disappointing feature is that that's not being made across Scotland. Indeed, across some communities, it's not been made. There are wide variations. And we have also been presented with, you know, a significant resource across Scotland, whether it be head teachers who are interested in this and opt in, others who show no interest, local authorities, some who show an interest but some don't. We have been presented with a role for the nurses and the family nurse partnership. We heard some this morning about the LAC nurse in terms of looked after children, the midwife, the health visitor. And, you know, and I put it to some of those people. This is a cluttered landscape. Has the Scottish Government got any idea about what sort of investment is available out there in terms of, you know, because to me it seems significant, but I'm not sure that it's been used to the best effect in a coordinated way, referring back to Richard Simpson's question. But there is seems to be a significant resource out there from youth workers, sexual health workers, people on the ground, you know. Do we know how much we're spending on this issue?
Well, it's difficult to say that we're spending this amount purely on preventing teenage pregnancies, largely because a lot of there's a very strong correlation between socioeconomic disadvantage and teenage pregnancy levels, and there's a whole range of resource that goes into areas of deprivation in order to try and help to tackle some of these inequalities that we have in society. And much of that will come from local authority side. It will also have third sector involvement, and it will also have health service involvement. So there's a whole range of areas where resource can have an impact on reducing teenage pregnancies rather than it just being within the specific teenage pregnancy bracket itself. If you were to ask me about the specific resource that goes in around the sexual health and bloodborne viruses strategy, that's about £29 million on an annual basis that we resource that with, and part of that goes towards issues around teenage health, sexual education programmes and a whole variety of other service provision. But the whole issue, because it's such a broad issue and there is such a strong link to socioeconomic disadvantage, there are many resources that go into tackling that whole issue that have an impact on teenage pregnancy levels as well, and it's incredibly difficult to be able to put your finger on exactly how much exact resources get into that specific area at any given time.
How difficult would it be in a particular area to identify all of the people who have got a part of their week, part of their time funded by local government, funded by the health service, funded by charities, third sector? How difficult would that be to associate? I don't know whether there is a linkage to the number, you know, of those. You mentioned deprivation, and while we clearly understand that that is a case, I mentioned last week, you know, Gaelton, Inverclyde, Gaelton, Port Glasgow are areas where deprivation is more than is evident, with at least 3 postcode areas that are you know, equivalent to what's happening in Glasgow in terms of deprivation. But if you go to Dundee, there's, you know, similar deprivation levels there. The teenage pregnancies in the under 16s are double what they are, and so it's a linkage, but obviously it's not the only cause there. But are we spending? Is there more resources in Inverclyde that make this you know, a challenge that they have had some effect on than there is proportionately in Dundee? How do we measure the resources in a given area, and you know, the commitment that's to that from local authorities and health boards? I wouldn't have thought that was difficult to.
It's probably easier to identify the health spend in some of these areas because of the very specific nature of the services they provide. So, for example, if in Inverclyde they're providing a drop-in sexual health service, for young people to make use of in order to get advice around STIs and contraception, then we can identify that. But the next building, if we've got a community centre that's been provided by the local authority, that's got a youth club that goes up to 16, and I think some of you may have visited the Citadel in Leith here in Edinburgh, which is an example of that. That's a service that's there for young people to help to keep them engaged and to get involved in their local community and to have a role within their local community. That to me is an important part of helping to potentially give young people opportunity to look at other issues rather than possibly thinking about getting into parenthood at a young age. It's difficult to isolate that, though, as saying that's money that's specifically going in to help to reduce teenage pregnancies. It may, as one of the results of it, help to reduce them, but it's not been specifically identified for that purpose. So I think from the health side, yes, we can. It is more difficult from a local authority point of view because there can be a range of services there for young people, youth workers, local authority education workers who are involved in school, working with those who might be at risk of dropping out of school and helping to retain them in education. Again, all have a contribution to make in helping to reduce the risks of young people getting into early parenthood. But it can be difficult to put a budget on that and then label that as being part of the overall strategy to reduce teenage pregnancies. I'm not trying to say that it can't be. I'm just saying that because they've got some of these services have got other purposes, it'd be difficult to label that a portion of that is to reduce teenage pregnancies.
But it leads us to a situation that the head teacher says, I'm here to educate children, not prevent teenage pregnancies. So a headmaster or a head teacher can opt in or out of that. A local authority can opt in or out of that. I mean, I suppose it's getting back to this. Where is that? Where is the focus on this? That we are requiring of people to deliver on some of the targets laid out by the strategies.
Well, there is a requirement, of course, for local authorities through the Curriculum for Excellence to cover sections around relationships, parenthood and sexual health, which local authorities would be responsible for taking up for within their own schools. And even prior to Curriculum for Excellence, there was a level of that provision within our own schools, which was delivered by teachers. What we have been able to do is to some of the work that we took forward in 2008 as part of the additional work on respect and responsibility was to look at how we can provide advice services out with schools that could be utilised by school-age pupils. So, for example, drop-in centres that could be used by young people to get advice and information from nurses. There's also the school nurses who are able to provide advice and information and to signpost them to particular services and sexual health clinics, and a number of health boards have taken that forward in partnership with local authorities. So there's advice that can be provided by a school nurse and to signpost them. There has been the development of some services around drop-in facilities which are out with the school but are close by that can be used by young people. And there is also the provision within the education curriculum around looking at relationships, parenthood and sexual health issues. I think they've all got a part to play. What I think can be challenging at times is to make sure that that's happening in a consistent way across the country in every local authority and health board area. I think part of the challenge in going forward is to see whether we can build on the progress that has been made to make sure that it is happening in a much more coordinated and joined up way.
Yeah, but I think that's what I was trying to get, because some of the projects that we have visited in Dundee and in Glasgow, they're not accessible to some people even in Glasgow or Dundee, I suppose, but they're certainly not available right across the country. School nurses are not available in all of areas and right across. Drop-in centres are not available. It gets us back to that situation. Do we believe that young people have the right to these services, which will improve right across the board, or do we not? Because currently they're not available across Scotland, many of these services.
Well, there's there's been different approaches taken in different local authority and health board areas in dealing with some of this. Some of the guidance that we issued in 2008 was to look at the development of drop-in facilities that were accessible for young people to get information in a youth-friendly way as well. The other part is that, what do you call, I think, which part of the challenge will be is to make sure that when a young person needs that advice and information, is to make sure that it's provided in a way that's most appropriate to them. And although school nurses aren't in the school all the time, they have access to being able to get advice from a school nurse, even if they're not necessarily within the school itself, should they need to get advice and information. So it's about the education provision, it's about the physical service provision as well, and also the support services that can be there with them. But trying to get that consistency has always been a challenge, but progress has been made. And some of the young people that I've met have been able to make use of these services. Some of the evidence we're getting as well from some of the experience I've had in Fife around how they've delivered some services over the last year, considering what young people have had to say about these services, have actually shown an improved uptake in the way in which they're accessing some of these services. So I think one of the challenges here might be is whether we're good enough at listening to young people on how they think some of these services could best be delivered. And I think there is scope for us to look at what their views are much more on how some of these services should be delivered, whether it be the drop-in services, whether it be the education in school, and to see whether we can use that to inform the way local authorities and health board take forward some of this work.
Will this require a shift in budgets then between the health board and the local authorities? Because we know that the health budget has been protected, but we know that there are difficult times in local authorities. Their budgets are not being protected. At the same time, we're asking them, and I think from Glasgow, they described their decision to set up the Young Mothers Unit as a brave one, and not necessarily cheap. So where will the money come from to get this equality of access and support across Scotland? Where will that?
In terms of preventing teenage pregnancies?
Preventing teenage pregnancies and supporting young mothers, which is...
Right.
We have been taking, we're looking at that across the board.
Okay. I think one of the key aspects of helping to prevent teenage pregnancies is very similar to many of the other issues around tackling health inequalities, and one of the key components of that is helping to try and help to retain young people in education for as long as possible, and to give them aspiration and an opportunity to move on after school, whether it be to employment or to a further or higher education opportunity. So I think that's a key part, and that's, in my views, a core part of a local authority's role just now, is to try and help to keep young people as engaged with education for as long as is reasonably possible, and obviously to help to support them in making informed choices should they choose to leave education at some particular stage. With regards to the idea of, for example, the base that you visited in Glasgow and the way in which the local authority have gone about establishing that, and for teenage mums, is an approach that they've taken in order to try and help to retain these young people within education in itself as part of their function, that if they're 15 and they've got an opportunity to stay on at school, then what can we do to help to support them as a mother in allowing them to do that and to remain within school as well. We've obviously also taken forward the national rollout of the family nurse partnerships as another approach which can help to support young teenage parents for the first time to look at a whole range of things which also can help to improve their educational outcome and also employment opportunities as well. So I think it's not a case of about do we need to give local authorities more money or do we have to give health boards more money. What I think we have to get a bit better at is them working together much more effectively and in a coordinated way And I think that gives an opportunity for them to look at how they can pool their resources much more effectively in both helping to reduce young people from becoming parents in the first place, but should they choose to do so, what they can do to try to help to support them in trying to be the best possible parent they can.
I agree with that, pool resources. That goes back to the original question. We've got to understand what resources are available, what's been spent by the health service, what's been spent by the education service, what's been spent by the local authorities, and in these areas. And if we maybe had some more of that information about the people and the resources and the budgets that we had in that area, we would maybe be able to provide that response to provide a wider service that is a preventive strategy which has become the buzzword. Bob Doris and then Nanette Millen.
Thanks, Convener. Just a very brief observation, Minister, before a question, and the Convener had mentioned head teachers and saying their focus is on educating people. I think I've met many a head teacher, and I have to say I think they take their wider role in terms of developing young people within their school very, very seriously, and it's not just about getting young people through exam results. And I think Curriculum for Excellence will only promote that further, and I think that's worth seeing in terms of the approach that I see within schools in Glasgow. I do want to touch a little bit on the varying successes of different local authorities in Scotland. Is there any... I know we can, if we have too many, where governments are accused either of having too many or not enough targets, they never just get it right. There's always opinions to have more or less. But in terms of targets and reducing teenage pregnancies, is there a target for the differential between the best performing and worst performing local authorities and addressing teenage pregnancy rates? Is there any kind of government target to see that differential narrow, or if not, is that consideration that you might consider in the future?
I think when we consulted on the sexual health and bloodborne viruses strategy, stakeholders appeared to want to focus much more on an outcome-focused strategy rather than having specific targets in one particular field that had to be achieved. And the 5 outcomes that are set out in the strategy reflect that type of view. Part of that, for example, and one of the outcomes is about reducing teenage pregnancies, and it's also about reducing terminations, etc. as well. So there are different component parts to that. And some of the work we undertake with local authorities or with health boards is looking at monitoring the progress that they are making in taking this forward. One of the things that I think there is merit in giving consideration to is whether there is a need to have some specific targets that are weighted in such a way that they give both health and local authorities much more of a focus on the areas where there are particular challenges. So rather than just saying, for example, if we were to look at establishing targets, and again I'd be interested in the committee's views on this, is that if we were to set a target of saying we wanted to reduce teenage pregnancies by 5% nationally, which would be tremendously ambitious, but if we were to look to do that, my view is that should be calibrated in such a way is that it's not just about a national 5%, but it's actually focusing in the areas where there are higher levels of teenage pregnancy. So whether it be the Dundees or the Fife areas where we know there are higher levels. So, but in doing that, I think it's got to be a shared target, and it would be a target that would have to be shared between local authorities and health boards because of the intrinsic nature of their role in trying to deal with this issue. And as I mentioned earlier, it may be one of the things that we could consider is whether we should take the teenage pregnancy issue out of the sexual health and bloodborne viruses strategy and have it as a standalone shared health local authority strategy, and part of that looking at whether there may be merit in having specific targets that can be shared between the local authority and the health board, but to be calibrated in a way that mean that the focus should be on those areas where there is a higher prevalence and a higher level of teenage pregnancies. That may be a way of trying to give some focus to how they go about meeting this, but the ultimate objective must be to improve overall outcomes as was set by the overall bloodborne viruses strategy.
I think you make a strong suggestion, and what I'd written down was a single accountable individual, irrespective of whether it's a local authority individual or a health service individual, who is capturing everything that's happening within either the local authority or health board area. And we had Alison Hadley at our committee last week, who took forward the England strategy for reducing teenage pregnancies, and the point she made, it wasn't about a nationally prescriptive plan necessarily from the centre into each local authority area, although she did think that was important. It was more about the focus. You know, the centre knew, the local authorities knew that the centre were watching to see what was happening, and that they would ask questions if there wasn't progress. And when we talk about targets, I know they can be quite artificial, but the advantage of targets isn't a case of you must always meet your target. It's a case of if you fall short of your target, have you moved some of the way towards it? If you haven't reached your target, how can we support you to go further in the future? And that is more of an outcome-based way of using targets, of course. So would you give consideration to a single individual whose responsibility it may be to pull all these threads together across the health service local authority area, and whichever other partners would seek to be involved in that initiative?
I'm happy to look at ideas that can assist us in meeting the challenges around teenage pregnancies. I'm sure that other members of the committee will be aware that it can often be challenging to get health boards and local authorities to come to agreement that a particular person is responsible for taking that forward. But I think there's a way in which we can try to get them on the same page in a more consistent way in dealing with some of these issues. Then I think that would be helpful, and I would welcome the committee's views on how they feel that can best be achieved, and what action you feel could be taken at a national level. I'm conscious that when you set a strategy at a national level, the strategy is completely dependent upon how that's then implemented on the ground, and local implementation of that. I think we have to be careful in not just looking at setting a national strategy, but with weak implementation at a local level. What can we do that can help to ensure there's effective implementation at a local level, but to do so in a way which is reflective of the local needs in that particular area? Not the same implementation right across the country, because it might not be appropriate. But, for example, in Fife, local implementation is likely to be different from the borders, but to allow them the flexibility to do that, and maybe to set some targets that would be shared between health and local authority and how they go about doing that. But I'm very open to looking at different ideas that can assist us in moving this further on from the progress that has been made in recent years.
I suppose national monitoring of local strategies is the way I'd like to look at it, so it's not seen as a top-down approach, but I think it is important that health boards and local authorities know that this is receiving some attention. Well, it clearly is receiving attention from government, but targets do focus in the mind somewhat. I know it's been very much process-driven, a lot of the questions so far, so I would actually like to speak about, now services on the ground, and I would agree that keeping young people in education is very, very beneficial for expectant mothers and young mothers once they've got their children, and whether it was Smithycroft in Glasgow, which clearly you looked at, Minister, or Wester Hailes Education Centre, which some of the committee members met, some of the young mothers who were taking part in that initiative before this committee formally started this morning. It seemed very important. One of the issues that's been raised with some of the committee members is that the services are getting increasingly advanced in meeting the needs of young mothers within education, but for a lot of young mothers, they've dropped out of education, and it's how they're then identified back into the system again. Now, obviously, the Family Nurse Partnership will get certain information to allow teenage mothers to enter into that system, but the information I've had is that it's not always, not talking about the Family Nurse Partnership now, Minister, but more general advice that comes to young mothers is, if they've left education, a discussion is not necessarily had with them to say, would you consider re-entering education, and whether it's a community school environment such as in Smithycroft in Glasgow or Wester Hailes in Edinburgh, that would be quite beneficial. But schools aren't informed necessarily of when when young adults in their care fall pregnant, there's issues in terms of confidentiality and who knows when someone is pregnant. So in terms of the sharing of data between health and education to make sure that teenage mothers and expectant mothers have the opportunity to see all the educational opportunities that exist, because in some cases they've not been informed of them, is the information I have. But where mothers have actually left education, teenage mothers, they're given the opportunity to opt back into it. Is that something you've looked at, or something the government would give consideration to maybe working a bit more effectively than it currently is?
I think it's there is an issue about the effectiveness of that, where a young person has dropped out of school education and may have become a parent and been able to go back into it as well. And although there's, for example, in Glasgow, they have tried to use some of the health professionals who work with young mothers to try and help who have got more specialism in working with young mothers where they can. I think there is an issue about how we can make sure that there is an opportunity for them to go back into education, which I think goes back to this multi-agency response and this coordinated approach that I think could assist mothers who are in that particular situation, where we have got health professionals, whether it be through the family nurse partnerships, if the young person, the young mum is engaged in that, where they where there might be good opportunities, but where they are not, but they may be working with a health visitor who might be supporting them, but not necessarily engaged with education colleagues and looking at educational opportunities for that particular young mum. So I think there's an opportunity to look at how that can be improved. The other part to that is that I think, and one of the things that I take very strongly from the discussion I had with young mums in the Citadel and also in Glasgow and in our areas, is that we need to make sure that when we try to identify solutions for some of these things, is that we listen to them on what is the best approach. And for some of them, going back to school isn't necessarily the best approach for them in going back into education for a variety of reasons. So it's about, I think there's an opportunity to look at how we can get better at doing that, but have it in such a way that doesn't prescribe a particular route that a young person should go down. Should they have dropped out of school education?
Thanks, Minister. Final brief question, Convener, in terms of the downward trend of teenage pregnancies currently, we are looking at it now from year to year. There's a long-term aspect to this as well, I would suggest, and I'm wondering what tracking would be done on that, because some of the evidence we've had, much of it anecdotal, I have to say, Minister, is that with the family nurse partnership, I believe, is evidence-based in terms of what I'm about to say, but in terms of Smithycroft, for example, some of it's anecdotal because it's early stages, that when you have young mothers and they're given the appropriate support, what you find is they are less likely to have a second child. If they do have a second child, the spacing between pregnancies is likely to be greater, and in the future, their children, in fact, may be less likely to be young parents themselves. So if we're looking at things in the round, it's not just about tracking changes over a 1 to 2 or even a 5-year period. It's about the kids that are being born to committed young mothers just now, and providing them the ample support so that in 15 years' time, and that's long-term planning, and I suspect most of us will be gone by that period of time around this particular committee, but is the government engaged in that kind of long-term planning?
Speak for yourself in terms of time around these matters there. But I think part of the there are obviously responses that you can take in the short term in terms of helping to support young parents, and also helping to support young people to choose not to become parents at an early stage in their life as well. But there is a longer term agenda here, and the family nurse partnerships have got an important part to play in that. They're not the only part, but they've got an important part to play, and it's got a strong evidence base over 30 years. You can see some of the from some of the pilots we had here in Lothian and in Tayside, and experience from it elsewhere is that some of the outcomes from using models such as family nurse partnerships do improve factors such as increasing the amount of time between the first child and the second child, reductions in smoking between smoking amongst pregnant mothers as well are significant. And you know, some of the stats are, for example, by age 4, there's a 20% longer interval between the first and second child from engagement through family nurse partnerships. There's an 83% increase in labour force participation for those who've been through family nurse partnerships, and there's a 46% increase in father's presence in the household for those who've engaged in family nurse partnerships. So there's an evidence base there that can help to improve not only the outcome for the mother while pregnant, but also I thought I heard Siri's name in the background, voice in the background there, but also helping to improve the outcome for both that parent and the child in the future. So, for example, if it can help to support a young mum in their parenting role and in preparing that child for education as well, which is part of the family nurse partnership, and there's evidence of the effect it can have in these areas, then that has a long-term benefit for both for the parent and also for the child, which has a long-term health benefit in the future, which is part of the approach we need to take to deal with some of the long-standing health inequalities that we face. So, yeah, you can take immediate measures around practical advice and information, but also putting in place some of the measures that can help to deal with some of the long-term issues that can arise from teenage parents in the family nurse partnerships is one of the responses around dealing with that type of issue, and it's got a good evidence base and outcomes it can help to achieve.
Annette Millen, followed by Mark MacDonald.
I wanted to ask a bit about community pharmacists, but before that, I'd like to touch on the SRE, the Sexual Relationships Education. The young mums that we spoke to this morning, there were 4 of them, and I think they were from, I don't know if they were from 4 different schools, but they certainly did have different school backgrounds. And they were, I think, unanimous in saying that they're still not really getting relationships education. There's plenty about biological side of sex, but not about relationships. And you're commenting on that within Curriculum for Excellence. And I don't know if you're confident that that will improve. So that's just an aside. But with regard to the community pharmacists, you know, they are very keen to have a role in providing short-term supplies of non-emergency contraception for people coming into the pharmacies. And I just wondered if you would consider extending the role of community pharmacists into providing non-emergency contraception, you know, after providing the emergency contraception that they initially asked for. And the other thing is that in prescribing emergency contraception, they would be very keen to get the longer-acting ulipristal as the sort of treatment of choice, you might say, because it's longer acting. And I wondered what you thought, or has any work been done on the costs and the benefits of providing the longer acting concept?
Okay. You know, from a discussion I had with young people is that there are very mixed reports about the nature of relationship and sexual education that's provided within schools, which I think we have to reflect upon. One of the things I was interested in was the approach that's been taken in Fife around a number of schools is that they have engaged very closely with the young people within these schools to identify what they think might be the best approach in dealing with some of these issues. So, for example, in moving to single-sex classes for particular issues was one of the issues that had been highlighted there and has been trialled to see whether that's more effective in allowing them to discuss issues in an open way, which they might not if it had been, if both sexes had been in the class. And one of the things that has struck me is that whether the approach we're taking around relationship and sexual health education in schools is whether we should really audit the views of young people and just how effective it is. We should ask them on how effective it is, and also whether what could be done to improve it, and what would allow you to get greater benefit from it. And it may be that's a piece of work that would actually produce some interesting suggestions around the change in approach that could be taken. And I don't know from your own evidence if this is a consistent picture you're hearing as well from young people, whether we should look at commissioning some sort of audit of young people's views of the way in which relationship and sexual health education has been provided in schools, to see if there's ways in which it could be altered and aligned to be more reflective of how they feel it could be delivered. So I'm very open to looking at that if that's something that the committee would feel would be helpful from the evidence that they've received as well. With regards to community pharmacy and the provision of contraception over the counter, I've what you call haven't come to a fixed position on this issue, but I think it's important that for any young person who's looking at taking oral contraception is that they also look at the other risk factors that are associated with sexual activity at that particular time, rather than just being provided with oral contraception. There are the issues around sexually transmitted infections that have to be considered, and there's a discussion which I think has to take place there. So I think it's not a case of saying that that pharmacies don't have a role. It's about recognising some of the wider agenda that goes with a young person going on to oral contraceptions, which can at times be best taken forward in discussion between a patient and their general practitioner at that given time, or a doctor within a sexual health clinic. So I think we'd have to be careful about changing the way in which that type of service is delivered, because of some of the other consequences that can come from young people being sexually active as well. So I think it's one of these things we need to look at what are all of the issues that need to be addressed, rather than just one specific aspect.
The feeling among some of the pharmacists is that some of the people coming into them would perhaps come into them and have the sort of discussion you're talking about, that they might not readily go to see their GP about, and that they just feel they've got, you know, an active role in that. I can see their point with the provisos that you're stating as well.
Yeah, I think part of the challenge around some of that, as I'm sure other members will be aware in terms of pharmacies, is confidentiality, and being able to have that type of discussion in a shop floor as well. So there is I'm not saying that these issues aren't insurmountable, but I think we have to be cautious about our approach in this because of some of the other issues that I think have to be considered.
What about the longer acting emergency contraception?
For pharmacists, this is the one which is the 120 hours rather than the 72 hours. My understanding is that presently the 120 hours is only available on prescription, and part of that is because of some regulation around this particular form of medication, which is why it still has to be restricted through prescription. But there are, and that's more of a regulatory issue around this particular medication, which I think there are some issues around possible side effects, or would you call it monitoring its use or whatever, which is part of the reason for it.
Just a very quick supplementary. I think that situation is actually just in the process of changing. The black triangles being taken off, which is the warning signal, and it's either is changing or is about to change. And there's an indication that, you know, the advantages of this particular compound over the original one, which was simply an adaptation of oral contraception, will be significant. And I hope that the Minister will look at it very carefully to make sure that health boards, local authorities, and indeed pharmacists are able to use this, the newer product, if it's deemed to be more effective as we think it is.
The principle is already there for community pharmacists to be able to provide this type of service. The issue around this particular piece of medication has been around some of the regulatory restrictions on it, which is why it had to be prescribed. If that changes, then there's an opportunity to then look at that, because the principle is already there for community pharmacists to provide emergency hormonal contraception.
Mark MacDonald.
Thank you, convener. There have been sort of two sides to the inquiry. One is focused on how we address the teenage pregnancy issue and prevent young people from becoming pregnant. But there's another side to that, which is, you know, in the real world, we're not going to have a situation where there are no teenage pregnancies and young people are going to find themselves becoming pregnant. And the other side to it is how we ensure that when a young person becomes pregnant, first of all, the right support is there in order to allow them to make the best choice for them, and in terms of whether they continue that pregnancy. And then should they choose to continue that pregnancy, how do we then support them in the appropriate way to ensure that not only do they get the best advice during the pregnancy, but also once the child is born, the right support is made available to them. Now, some of the evidence that we've had is that the reaction and the stigma that is attached to being a teenage parent holds back some of that support, in the sense that the reaction initially to a young person becoming pregnant is often very negative, and the young people themselves can find it difficult to access support services because they feel reluctant to do so on the proviso that they think they will be judged, based again on some of the interactions that they've had. So is there work being done, obviously alongside the strategy in terms of reducing the levels of teenage pregnancy? Is there work also being done to try and ensure that where support services are required, they are tailored in such a way that they are accessible to young people, and the attitudes towards those young people who choose to continue their pregnancy, how do we take those and change them around?
There is some work that's taking place in some health board areas around how they can make sure that their services are much more accessible. Some of the guidance that we issued in 2008 around respect and responsibility was to encourage health boards to look at the delivery of services which were much more, if you want, young person friendly, to try and help to make them as accessible for them as possible. For example, in trying to have them closer to schools where they could be provided, and also to try and provide them in a way that they did not feel were judgmental, as well, around young people who are either engaging in sexual activity or whether they are pregnant. So some work has been undertaken to try and help to encourage that, and also to help to support some of the work that our school nurses take forward in schools as well, in that they're able to signpost them to the right services and the right support for advice and information as and when necessary. I'm conscious, though, that there is, and it's an issue that's constantly raised with me by young mums, is about some of the issue of the stigma that can often be associated with being a young parent. Part of the challenge, I think, is to make sure that we have the right services for young people who are parents, and the Family Nurse Partnership is a very good example of that. And by the end of this year, about a third of those young people who can make use of that service should be covered by that service, with the complete national rollout being completed in 2015. So there's a lot of work taking place there at the present moment. I think Glasgow are actually are at the point where they've just started the service. So I think that's a very good example of the type of service that's there to support young people in a non-judgmental way, and to help to improve outcomes for both them during pregnancy, and also for their child, and also for them once they become a parent in moving forward in their life. I think part of the stigma, unfortunately, at times is also through negative media presentation of this issue, which can often create a public perception that is not necessarily true. And part of the sexual health and bloodborne viruses strategy has an outcome focus on it, which is around looking at trying to change that perception within the media. For example, our Let's Talk About It campaign, Sex, Let's Talk About It, which again is launching this month, is about trying to break down some of these barriers around talking about sexual issues, which I think can help to address some of the stigma that has developed around public perception, but also making sure that we have the right services that can support people during their pregnancy and also when they are a young mum.
Obviously, and interesting that we finished there on young mum, because a lot of the focus, and rightly in some respects, has been around the role of the female, the role of the mum. But in a lot of these cases, not all of these cases, but in a lot of these cases, there's also a young dad and a young man who has become a father as a result. And some of the feedback that we've received has been that the services are not necessarily tailored to giving the best support to young men, both in terms of the initial messaging, but then also in terms of the support for them when they find themselves in a situation of becoming a parent as well. Obviously, there are often barriers in their way. For example, there may be a reluctance from the family of the young female to have the young male involved. Again, that attaches itself to the stigma issue. But for example, when we were in Dundee and we were looking at the young mums unit, a very good resource at Mingus Hill High School, I asked the question of, if the father of the child is also in education, does he have the same option as the mother to relocate to the school in order to have contact with his child? And at present that's not the case. Do you think that maybe there is more work that needs to be done in order to ensure that where services are there, that young men and young dads are also being factored into that?
There are two parts to this. I think there is still more work to be done in young men understanding and recognising their responsibility around the use of contraception. I think at times a lot of the focus can be on young women. So I think there's certainly more work that can be undertaken in making sure that young men recognise their responsibility in this area more. But I think there is certainly more that can be done in trying to work with young fathers and helping to engage them. There will always be the challenge around, for example, you will be aware that the base in Glasgow takes in young mums from across different parts of Glasgow, some of which they travel a fair distance to actually make use of that service, and there are obviously challenges in doing that with young fathers as well. But I think there is an opportunity for us to look at how we can actually try to help to improve engagement of young fathers. I mentioned earlier on, for example, the outcomes from family nurse partnerships are a good example of how very often young fathers can actually help to be engaged much more effectively in their parenting role and in their responsibilities. I think we need to look at how we can build upon that in education as well, and what we can do to try and help to support young fathers as well in helping to retain and maintain their education.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions for Committee? Aileen?
Thanks very much, Convener. Minister, one of the questions I wanted to ask was around our kind of relationship with alcohol. And obviously that we have a small percentage of teenage pregnancies that are not only just unplanned, but they're also, alcohol's involved. So it's in terms of how we try to increase having a healthy relationship with alcohol and getting our young people to try and kind of understand the kind of health effects that can have on, their actual pregnancy itself.
I think it goes back to my one of my first comments, and that is that the whole issue of dealing with the issue of teenage pregnancies is very similar to many of the other aspects that drive health inequalities in our society. Socio-economic inequality, it can be alcohol, poverty, drugs misuse, all of which can contribute to these issues. And I think that's why that we need to look at the whole issue of teenage pregnancies within that broader policy field about the role that they can play. And there's no doubt that alcohol will be a contributory factor in some cases. And part of the work we're taking forward with the alcohol framework is to try and help to make sure that young people have a clearer understanding of the harm that alcohol can cause them and the consequences that can come from that. And there's an important educational role there that we need to keep taking forward with young people.
Any other questions? Can I thank you, Minister, and your officials throughout the morning. We appreciate the evidence you've given us and the time we've had with you this morning. Thank you very much. We now move to... Yeah, that concludes the public session. One final item which we agreed earlier, item 9, to take in private with NHS waiting times.